On an April morning in 1994, in a quiet house above Seattle's grey waters, far from the roar of the stadiums that once chanted his name, a man with the saddest blue eyes in rock and roll was found by an electrician who had come to install a security system. The world knew him as the voice of a generation, yet the final 48 hours of his life remain a wound that will not close. For 3 decades, detectives, private investigators and fans have chased the same question. But there is one thing everyone agrees on. Someone is lying. On the 1st of April 1994, Kurt Cobain climbed over a roughly 6-foot fence at the back of the Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles and walked away from the facility that was supposed to save his life. He did not use the main entrance. He simply found the least dignified way out and took it, leaving behind a rehab program he had entered just 2 days earlier. That same morning, a taxi driver named Michael Carlson was the last person officially confirmed to have seen Cobain alive, driving him the long stretch from Marina del Rey back to his house in Seattle. Carlson later described a passenger who sat in silence for the entire ride, smoking cigarettes and staring out the window, offering no hint of what was coming next. For the next 4 days, Cobain moved through the world mostly unseen, making phone calls and buying tools for a purpose that only he knew. The last recorded call from Cobain came on the morning of April 5, around 8 to 8:30, when he phoned Courtney Love at the Hotel Lux on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. In that conversation, he told her that no matter what happened, she had made a great record, and the words hung in the air like a goodbye she could not yet decode. 3 days later, on April 8, a 54-year-old electrician named Gary Smith arrived at Cobain's house to install a security system and happened to glance through an upper window where he saw a body lying motionless with a pool of blood near its ear. Smith initially thought it was a mannequin, but the realization of what he had actually found sent him into a spiral of trauma that required years of therapy. He called 911 at 8:41 in the morning, and the operator logged a report that would eventually become one of the most scrutinized death investigations of the 20th century. The official announcement stated that Kurt Cobain had died on April 5, which created a strange 3-day gap between the moment of death and the discovery of the body, a lag that the Seattle Police Department explained as a normal consequence of a secluded home, and no one checking on the resident for several days. That timeline became the backbone of the accepted narrative, the story that ran in newspapers and on television, the story that seemed clean and logical and final. The police concluded that Cobain had taken his own life with a shotgun, and they closed the case within weeks, confident that the evidence pointed in one direction. But even as they sealed the files, certain details surfaced that did not fit the neat official version, small anomalies that no officer could explain away. The investigation declared it a suicide, yet the fingerprints, the distance of the shot, and the timing of the final phone call all raised questions that never received proper answers. That was the story the public was asked to believe, clean, straightforward and closed. But this is where the official account begins to crack, because the man hired to help find Cobain before the body was discovered refused to accept what the police presented. That was the story the public was asked to believe, clean, straightforward and closed. But this is where the official account begins to crack, because the man hired to help find Cobain before the body was discovered refused to accept what the police presented. And it wasn't just a hunch. He had receipts, timestamps, and a growing pile of inconsistencies that made the official narrative feel less like a conclusion and more like a construction. The man's name was Tom Grant, a former LAPD detective turned private investigator, and his obsession with the Cobain case would consume the next 3 decades of his life. What he found, or rather what he pieced together from phone records and witness statements, suggested that the timeline the police had endorsed was built on shaky ground. For instance, the taxi driver Michael Carlson, who had driven Cobain from the Exodus Recovery Center back to his Lake Washington home on April 1, later told investigators that during the ride, Cobain seemed composed. He made small talk about the weather, paid his fare in cash, and walked into the house without hesitation. That description didn't match a man who would allegedly shoot himself 4 days later, not according to the people who knew him best. Grant also noted that the call to Courtney Love on the morning of April 5, placed at roughly 8 or 8:30, lasted around 2 minutes, just long enough for a brief goodbye, but long enough, Grant argued, for someone else to have been in the house listening. He pressed the police for the phone records, and they refused. When the autopsy report finally leaked, a forensic expert Grant consulted pointed out that the amount of heroin found in Cobain's bloodstream, 3 times the lethal threshold, might have incapacitated him within minutes of injection, meaning he would have struggled to even grasp the shotgun, let alone position it cleanly against his head. The medical examiner, however, had ruled the manner of death as suicide without waiting for toxicology results, a procedural shortcut that Grant called gross negligence. He wasn't alone in his suspicions. Gary Smith, the electrician who discovered the body, recounted to the Seattle Times how the scene felt staged. The shotgun resting on Cobain's chest as if carefully laid, his glasses neatly aligned beside him, and the absence of soot on his hand, a detail that contradicted the theory of a self-inflicted shot. This is where your viewing should slow down, because the cracks aren't just cracks, they're doors. The official account relied on a 3-day gap that no one could fill, a final call that no one could verify beyond a hotel switchboard, and evidence that Grant argued was mishandled from the first hour. And yet the narrative persisted, not because it was airtight, but because it was convenient. The case was closed in April 1994, and the world moved on, but Grant moved sideways, digging through court filings and old interviews, always arriving at the same divergence. The circumstantial evidence didn't add up, and the physical evidence was either ignored or brushed under a procedural rug. So when you ask why the police wanted you to believe this version, the answer isn't conspiracy, it's inertia. A high-profile death is a massive liability, and a quick ruling saves resources, protects reputations, and satisfies the public need for closure. But closure built on shaky foundations eventually sags, and you can see the first dip in the floorboards right here, in the discrepancy between the taxicab ride and the toxicology report, between the soot-free hand and the 3-day silence. That silence was not the silence of a secluded home. It was the silence of unanswered questions that the official story chose to ignore. The fact is, the bullet that ended Kurt Cobain's life was real, but the why and the how, the context and the details, have never been fully settled, and the men who could have settled it were too quick to shut the book. So what the police wanted you to believe was as much about faith as investigation. Faith that a grieving widow couldn't orchestrate a cover-up. Faith that a man so celebrated couldn't have been murdered and cleaned up. Faith that a shotgun blast, heard from a house with its doors unlocked, and a note on a penholder, was exactly what it appeared to be. But faith isn't evidence, and as the next chapter unfolds, you'll see how one man's stubborn refusal to accept that faith revealed a labyrinth of half-truths, missing reports, and a story that refused to stay buried. On April 3, 1994, Courtney Love hired a private investigator named Tom Grant, a former Beverly Hills police detective, to find her missing husband, after she had already enlisted another search team recommended by the Los Angeles police, with the total cost of hiring detectives recorded at around $14,000. Grant took the case expecting a routine missing person search, but what he uncovered over the following days would consume the next 3 decades of his life. He began to suspect foul play almost immediately, not because of what he found at the scene, but because of what he found in his own paperwork. Grant has always maintained that the signature on his own contract, dated April 3, 1994, was forged, and that he never received the original document, a claim he has repeated in interviews for nearly 30 years. Think about that for a moment. A man is hired to find a missing person, and the very contract that binds him to the job turns out to be a fake. Who forges a contract with a detective they just hired, and why? The Seattle Police Department ruled Kurt Cobain's death a suicide, but Grant rejected that conclusion and spent more than 20 years conducting his own independent investigation, a fact that has been well documented by outlets like Rolling Stone. He has since poured over $500,000 of his own money into the case, conducted over 100 interviews, and published a 300-page dossier online, all without ever being paid to do so by anyone. In his own words, he says he had no financial motive. He simply could not let a murder case pass in silence. This is where the story takes its sharpest turn, because Grant is not some armchair conspiracy theorist posting from his basement. He is a credentialed former detective who worked homicide cases for years before going private. He knew what a suicide scene looked like, and when he walked through the details of this one, he says nothing added up. The question that haunts his investigation is a simple one. If the official narrative is so clean, so straightforward, why does the evidence keep pointing in a different direction? The most disturbing part of Grant's story is not what he found, but how he was treated when he tried to share it. He was dismissed by the police, mocked by the press, and written off as a publicity seeker, despite the fact that he had been hired by the family and had no reason to invent a conspiracy. He built his case methodically, using the same procedures he had learned as a detective, cross-checking witness statements, examining physical evidence, and requesting public records through formal channels. His process is a masterclass in how to verify a famous case using public documents, starting with identifying the agency that holds the records, submitting a written request with specific case numbers and timeframes, and then comparing whatever comes back against at least 3 independent sources before drawing any conclusion. It is a slow, unglamorous, and thoroughly professional approach, and it has made him a pariah in some circles and a hero in others. But here is the thing: a private detective can be wrong. He can misread evidence, misinterpret motives, and chase false leads. That happens all the time. But when the contract that hired him turns out to be a forgery, that is not a matter of interpretation. That is a fact. And it is a fact that demands an explanation the official story has never provided. The toxicology report delivered the first contradiction. The morphine concentration in Cobain's blood at the time of death was measured at 1.52 milligrams per litre, roughly 3 times the level typically considered lethal. The Washington State Toxicology Laboratory's finding was so extreme that it pushed the narrative away from a simple, clean act of volition. A person in that state, incapacitated by a dose that would stop the heart of a habitual user, must have been utterly immobile. The official story demanded that this man, in his final moments, performed a complex physical task with a shotgun. The chemical evidence alone whispered otherwise. Then came the detail that should have halted the entire investigation. Seattle police reported that the shotgun found beside Cobain bore no fingerprints at all, not even his own. The incident report, filed under number 94121367, documented the absence of any identifying marks on the weapon. Consider the mechanical reality of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The hand pulls the trigger, the weapon recoils, and rigor mortis sets in, locking the fingers around the metal. A clean firearm in a suicide scenario is a statistical phantom. This single fact, so easily verified, so starkly anomalous, created an unbridgeable gap between the physical evidence and the official conclusion. To understand the weight of that absence, look at the data from his home county. A study conducted by the University of Washington between 1994 and 1998 examined gun suicides across King County. The researchers found that in 92% of the cases, the victim's fingerprints were present on the weapon. The pattern was overwhelming, almost universal. The human hand in the final spasm of self-inflicted death leaves its mark. Cobain's shotgun was clean, placing his death squarely in the anomalous 8%. The statistical outlier became the cornerstone of doubt, a single silent object that refuted the tidy story being told. The weapon itself posed another problem. Forensic examination determined that the distance between Cobain's head and the muzzle of the shotgun was roughly 12 to 15 inches. The King County Medical Examiner's report described this as unusual, a cautious understatement that screamed for attention. A self-inflicted shotgun wound to the head is almost always a contact wound, the barrel pressed hard against the skin or inside the mouth, leaving distinct burn marks and soot patterns. A gap of a foot means the gun was not against his body when it fired. That distance suggests a mechanism, a trigger pulled by a string or a device, anything other than a trembling finger pressed directly against the steel. The physical examination of the body added another layer of inexplicable detail. At the coroner's inquest, the medical staff from King County confirmed that Cobain's left arm bore scratches and bruises that were inconsistent with self-harm. They stated the injuries were not self-inflicted. The phrasing was clinical, precise, and damning. The official narrative had already been written, but the body itself was testifying to a different sequence of events. A man in the depths of a suicidal haze does not pause to struggle physically with another person. The bruises suggested a confrontation, an altercation, a resistance that the clean suicide narrative had no room to accommodate. 4 isolated anomalies can be dismissed as coincidence, the chaotic noise of a messy world. A missing fingerprint could be a fumble. An unusual distance could be a fluke of physiology. A set of bruises could be the result of a fall. But when all 4 anomalies converge within a single case file, coincidence becomes an act of intellectual cowardice. The toxicology, the fingerprint, the ballistics and the contusions form a silent choir that sings one coherent song. It is the song of a death that did not happen the way the official report described it. a melody of evidence that the investigators refused to hear. Kurt Cobain was born on the 20th of February 1967 in Aberdeen, Washington, a small timber town of roughly 16,000 people where the sawmills groaned day and night and the rain rarely let up. That town, according to biography.com in 2021, was a place of quiet desperation, the kind of working-class landscape that would seep into every chord he ever wrote. He was a sickly, artistic child, caught between the divorce of his parents and a town that had no language for a boy who drew and painted and refused to play sports. His escape, as it so often is for the lonely, was music, but the music he would make was not born of ambition, but of an almost unbearable sensitivity to the world around him. Then came the explosion. On the 24th of September 1991, Nirvana released Nevermind, an album that would not just top the Billboard 200 chart by January of 1992, but would rip a hole in the fabric of popular culture, selling over 30 million copies worldwide, according to Billboard and the RIA. Cobain, the reluctant prophet of a generation, was suddenly the most famous man in rock and roll, and he was utterly unprepared for it. Here was the counterintuitive twist that defines his tragedy. Rolling Stone and Michael Azerrad's book, Come As You Are, estimated that he earned roughly $10 million in royalties from that album in 1992 alone, and yet he remained trapped in the most severe stage of heroin addiction. The money was a lifeline, and he used it to dig his own grave. His relationship with the drug began by his own account in interviews in 1986 when he was just 19, as he told Spin magazine in 1993. But by 1990, the casual use had hardened into a full-blown daily dependency that no amount of chart success could touch. He was not just a user, he was a captive, and the captivity was not merely physical. Charles Cross's biography, Heavier Than Heaven, and his medical records from 2001 show that by 1992, Cobain had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and attention deficit disorder, and that suicidal ideation had been a constant companion since 1991, according to the testimony of his own wife and friends. This is the portrait of a man besieged from within, his psyche a battleground of chemical storms, and his body a vessel that was slowly shutting down. And yet, this is where the meticulous work of a real investigator, the kind that Charles Cross employed while writing Heavier Than Heaven, forces you to pause and look closer. It was Carlson who on the 30th of March 1994 accompanied Cobain to Stan's gun shop and signed the paperwork for the Remington 20-gauge shotgun because Kurt's own permit had lapsed. Carlson, the sole witness to this transaction, would later confess to his interviewer a lifetime of regret, saying, "If I had said no, maybe he wouldn't have done it that day." This was a man who could not legally buy a gun, who was in the grip of a substance so powerful it had eroded his physical autonomy, and yet the official narrative demands that he somehow summoned the precision and force to pull that trigger. But can a body steeped in such poison truly commit an act requiring such deliberate, controlled force? Or are we to accept a version of events that simply feels too convenient? The cab pulled up outside the house on Lake Washington Boulevard, and the man in the back seat finally stirred. Michael Coulson, the driver who had just completed the 30-kilometer run from Marina del Rey back into the city, watched his passenger climb out into the grey April morning. Kurt Cobain had spoken almost nothing during the entire journey, just sat there smoking in silence, staring through the window at a world he seemed to have already left behind. Coulson would later tell Charles R. Cross, the biographer who documented every detail of those final days, that there was something hollow about the man, a stillness that went beyond mere exhaustion. The phone rang at the Lux Hotel on Sunset Boulevard just after 8 in the morning, and Courtney Love picked it up to hear her husband's voice on the other end of the line. His words were strange, almost ceremonial, as if he were delivering a eulogy for something that had not yet died. "Whatever happens," he told her, I just want you to know that you made a great record." Love would repeat that sentence for the rest of her life, turning it over in interviews, in sworn declarations, in the quiet hours when she tried to make sense of what she had heard. It was the kind of thing a man says when he is saying goodbye, and yet it told her nothing about where he was or what he planned to do next. But here is where the story begins to fray at the edges. Michael Stipe, the frontman of REM and one of Cobain's closest friends, spoke to him by telephone on the evening of April 3, and he described the conversation in an interview with Rolling Stone as completely unremarkable. Cobain sounded perfectly normal, Stipe insisted, talking about getting together soon and working on a new album, full of plans for the future that a truly depressed man would never have bothered to make. How do we reconcile that version of Kurt Cobain with the silent figure in the taxi, the man who seemed to be disappearing in real time? The contradiction sits there uneasily, two portraits of the same person painted just hours apart. The neighbour's testimony only deepens the fog. Cynthia Anderson, a 71-year-old woman who lived next door on Lake Washington Boulevard, told police that she had been gardening in her front yard on the afternoon of April 5 when she heard two loud noises coming from the Cobain residence, sharp sounds like firecrackers or something heavier, around 11:30 in the morning. She did not think much of it at the time, and she did not contact the authorities until after the body was discovered 3 days later. Her statement was filed away in the case records, a small piece of paper that would sit unexamined for 20 years until researchers finally pulled it out through a public records request filed with Muckrock. What are we supposed to make of these three accounts? A taxi driver who saw a man so withdrawn he barely seemed present, a friend who heard a voice full of plans and energy on the telephone, and an elderly woman who heard two gunshot-like sounds from the house hours before any of the official timeline suggests Cobain was already dead. Three people, three versions of the same 48 hours, and somewhere in the space between them lies whatever really happened in that quiet house on the lake. The record shows no further calls from the Cobain residence after 8:30 that morning, no activity that would explain a man moving through his final hours, just the silence that followed and the neighbour's memory of those two sharp reports echoing across the garden. Someone is telling the truth, and someone is not, but the puzzle refuses to give up its answer. The Seattle Police Department's own protocols demand that a firearm be secured as evidence, yet after seizing weapons from the residence on March 18th, they left another gun behind, an oversight that contradicts their standard operating procedure. This failure to secure the scene's potential evidence is a fundamental breach of investigative integrity, not a minor clerical error. How can a department claim a thorough investigation when its officers cannot even follow their own checklist for evidence collection? The decision to leave a weapon unidentified and unsecured, the home of a man they considered a suicide risk, is a decision that defies all logic. This single act of negligence suggests a level of carelessness that should invalidate the entire investigation. It forces a critical question. Were these errors born of incompetence, or was there a deliberate decision to look the other way? The police report would also reveal that the initial classification for the incident was not a suicide, but a more ambiguous death investigation, a designation that allows for a broader scope of inquiry. This careful, open-minded label is at odds with the final definitive conclusion of suicide, which was declared with seemingly undue haste. Perhaps most telling is the handling of the suicide note itself. The note, which is meant to be a crucial piece of evidence, was never tested for fingerprints. Investigators reportedly just looked at it with the naked eye. This is a standard procedure in any death investigation, as it could confirm who handled the note and when. By failing to do so, the police left a gaping hole in the evidence, one that independent forensic analysts have since highlighted as a critical failure. And then there is the date. The note was signed with the date April 4th. Yet handwriting analysis suggests it could have been written days earlier. This discrepancy is a fundamental challenge to the official timeline, suggesting a premeditation that does not fit with the narrative of a spontaneous, impulsive act. Is it possible the note was crafted before the final 48 hours even began, turning it from a final goodbye into a pre-arranged piece of a larger script? The inherent logic of the scene of a shotgun suicide dictates a certain sequence. First, secure the scene. Second, locate the weapon. Third, collect any available evidence. When the first responders arrived on March 8, 1994, they found a body, a weapon, and a note. Yet, the subsequent inventory of the residence revealed another anomaly. When police seized a cache of weapons on March 18, following Courtney Love's call, they recorded 4 guns, including a Colt 45. Those confiscated. But according to the scene reports, a different firearm was left behind. Why would officers meticulously catalogue one set of weapons under a psychiatric hold, yet fail to secure another gun found in the immediate vicinity of a man with a self-inflicted head wound? This is not an oversight, it is a contradiction. It places a firearm in the same household as a person deemed to be a danger to himself, mere weeks before his death, and it suggests that the police did not treat the first incident with the same gravity as the second. The cognitive dissonance required to secure the house on the 18th and ignore a weapon on the 8th is so profound that it borders on deliberate. The failure to process the scene for latent prints is compounded by the question of the note's physical condition. The paper was found resting on a canister of potting soil, weighted down by a pen. It appeared untouched, almost staged. Yet the original death investigation classification, code 941121367, remained open for months. It was not officially closed until June, when Police Chief Norman Stamper formally sealed the file as a suicide. For 3 months the case hovered in a bureaucratic purgatory, neither fully investigated nor definitively shut down. That period was not spent re-examining the scene or chasing leads. It was spent waiting for the public pressure to subside. If the answer was so clear, why did the official closure take a quarter of a year? Why did it require the personal intervention of the Chief of Police to finalise a note, a shotgun and a corpse? Let's take a step-by-step look at standard protocol for a suspected gunshot death. 1. Photograph the scene from multiple angles to document the exact state of the room. 2. Tag and log every piece of biological matter, casing and firearm for ballistic analysis. 3. Seizure of the weapon to test for residue on the hands. 4. Examine the victim's hands for stippling to confirm the distance of the shot. 5. Collect any hard copy material for handwriting and ink analysis to determine the time of writing. In the Cobain case, step 5 was violated by relying on visual inspection alone. The ink dating test, a simple solvent-based process that can establish relative age of the ink on the page, was never performed. If the ink was days old, as the handwriting analysis suggested, the note becomes a pre-written item, which is absurd for a man who was supposed to have written it in a fit of desperation. Is it possible that the police skipped these steps because they already knew the outcome was suicide? Or is it more likely that they were willing to ignore procedural integrity to avoid a deeper, more complex investigation? The answer is uncomfortable. The evidence points to a systemic failure, one that allowed a potentially flawed conclusion to stand unopposed for decades. Each missed fingerprint, each unlogged gun, and each dismissed date discrepancy builds a case for a fundamentally flawed investigation, a case where the conclusion was reached before the questions were asked. So if this was the simplest, most open and shut suicide in modern history, why was the process so astonishingly messy? Why did the professionals leave more questions than answers behind a storyline that was supposedly so clean? 30 years later, the case still refuses to close, not because the evidence is lacking, but because the contradictions pile up until they form a wall. Consider the accusation that Tom Grant spent decades pressing, that Courtney Love hired a killer named Eldon Hoke, better known as El Deuce, the frontman of the Mentors, and that El Deuce himself claimed in the 1998 documentary Kurt and Courtney that Love offered him $50,000 to murder Cobain. It is a staggering claim, the kind that usually dies in the tabloids, yet it gained traction because of what happened next. On the 19th of April 1997, just weeks after the documentary aired his statement, El Deuce was found dead, struck by a train near his home in Riverside, California. The official cause was ruled an accident, but the circumstances were never fully clarified. Now apply the first step of the evaluative framework we have been using. List the unresolved questions. Why would a man make such a specific allegation and then die before any serious investigation could question him further? The coincidence is not proof, but it is the kind of loose end that refuses to be tied. Then there is the suicide note itself, which introduces a different kind of dissonance. In it, Cobain wrote the now famous line, "I haven't felt the excitement of listening to and creating music, along with really writing something for too many years." A statement of artistic exhaustion that has been quoted endlessly as evidence of his despair. But here is where the analytical process demands that we check the physical evidence against the official interpretation. The note bore a handwritten date of April 4th, yet independent handwriting analysis suggested the ink and paper indicated it may have been written days earlier, which would mean a man in a supposedly impulsive, drug-fueled spiral had composed his farewell well in advance. And buried deeper in the 600 pages of case files released to the public, there is a single note from a police officer, a handwritten scrap that reads, "Cobain, I didn't commit suicide. Don't let them say I did," reportedly a recollection from a friend of Cobain's. It is not a sworn statement, it is not even attributed clearly, but it exists in the official record, which means someone in the department thought it worth writing down. So we reach the point where we must weigh the motives of every party involved, the third step in our framework. The Seattle police had a dead celebrity, a note that looked like a confession, and a public hungry for closure, and they closed the case in June of 1994. Tom Grant, the private detective, had no financial incentive to keep digging, as he had already been paid, and had publicly stated that he spent over $500,000 of his own money over the years, and yet he built a 300-page dossier arguing for homicide. Courtney Love had everything to gain from a suicide verdict and everything to lose from a murder investigation, and her own hired investigator turned against her. And then, in September of 2021, the Seattle police reviewed the entire case file again, after an anonymous letter to the Seattle Times claimed that a third person had been in the house that day, and they still returned the same verdict. At some point you have to ask, is a conclusion that requires this much maintenance actually solid, or is it just the most convenient one? The final step is to judge the consistency of witness statements against the known physical facts, and this is where the case becomes genuinely maddening. No witness in Cobain's inner circle described him as having a specific plan to kill himself in those last 48 hours, with the sole exception of Courtney Love, who was not in Seattle and never saw him directly. A neighbor named Cynthia Anderson reported hearing two loud noises like gunshots at around 11:30 in the morning on April 5th, yet the official timeline insists there was only one shot. The shotgun had no fingerprints on it, despite a University of Washington study showing that 92% of gun suicides leave the victim's prints on the weapon. The distance from the barrel to the head was measured at 12 to 15 inches, which forensic experts described as unusual for a self-inflicted wound. And Frances Bean Cobain, the daughter who grew up in the shadow of this endless argument, said it best in a handwritten letter to Rolling Stone in 2014. "I have read everything people write about my father. The only thing I am certain of is that no one but him knows the truth, and even he in his state may not have known it. She was a child when he died. She became the sole heir to an empire worth tens of millions of dollars a year, and she still refuses to claim certainty." That is the real takeaway. The case remains open, not because the mystery is unsolvable, but because the evidence, when examined honestly through a process of listing the gaps, comparing them to official reports, assessing each player's motivation, and checking every testimony against the physical record, leads to a dead end that no amount of certainty can pave over. The official case file runs 600 pages, released in 2014 by the Seattle Police Department through Muckrock, and it contains crime scene photographs and interview recordings the public had never seen. That archive, for all its bulk, holds a single remarkable fact. Not one witness in Cobain's inner circle described him as having a specific suicidal intention during those final 48 hours. The only account suggesting otherwise came from Courtney Love, who was not in Seattle and never saw him directly. A legal case can close, a stamp can be pressed onto a folder, and the world can move on to the next headline. But the absolute truth of what happened in that room above the garage is a different creature entirely. One that does not care about paperwork. You can open that 600-page file yourself, trace every statement, and weigh every inconsistency, because the documents are public and the link sits in the description below. The man who found him that morning, the electrician who thought he was looking at a mannequin, went to therapy afterwards and told the Seattle Times he had never seen anything like it. So the question at the center of this entire story was never really about who last saw him alive, though the taxi driver Michael Carlson can answer that one. The question that lingers is what actually happened inside that house during the hours nobody was watching. And that is a door that no document, no matter how many pages it holds, has ever managed to open. You tell me which version you believe down in the comments, because the one thing both sides have always agreed on is that somebody was not telling the truth. And every retelling of that morning bends under the weight of whoever is doing the telling. The detectives saw a closed case and went home to dinner. The journalists saw a career-defining scoop and wrote their angles. The fans saw a broken idol and carved meaning out of the tragedy. None of them saw the same room, though all of them studied the same photographs. That is the quiet horror of it. The physical evidence sits unchanged in a temperature-controlled archive. But the people who interpret it arrive with their own grief, their own ambition, their own need for clarity. The tape from the interview where Love described the suicide note The one recorded 20 years after the fact has a specific rhythm to it, a practiced cadence that sounds different on the fifth listen than it does on the first. And the 600 pages are never truly read cold. They are read through the lens of everything the reader already believes, which means the file is always a mirror before it is a window. You will not escape that. I could not escape it either, and I read every single line twice. The smell of old photocopies and redacted ink is not something you can describe to someone who has never held archival paper, but it lingers in your hands long after you close the folder. There is a thickness to the pages near the crime scene photos, a glossy insert that feels out of place next to the grainy witness statements. You will notice that when you read them, and you will notice that the closing summary never once names an accomplice, never once explains the syringe cap found in the room, never once resolves the multiple handwriting analyses that disagreed with each other. Those details are not missing from the file. They are present in black and white, waiting for someone to ask the right question. So ask it. Then ask yourself why the official version has survived so long without ever once being tested under the same scrutiny the fans have applied to every alternate theory. And after you have turned the last page, you will understand why the door does not close, why the case has never felt finished, and why the truth we accept is often just the story we were told first, before we had a chance to look for ourselves.